Milei's economic policies are garnering attention around the world, including having won this year's Milton Friedman Award. Milei's speech focuses on how Milton Friedman dismantles Keynes' general theory. Somewhat surprisingly, Milei starts by praising Keynes as a great mathematician. In another speech, Milei says Keynes' general theory is formidable written and a work of art for evil, creating a mathematical structure that is music to the ears of messianic, corrupt, thieving politicians. It struck me when Milei mentioned that Keynes was a mathematician. That Keynes was a mathematical Platonist.
I want to thank you for this award, and given the name of the award, it seemed pertinent to me to make a talk about Milton Friedman's academic contribution.
Hacer una charla sobre la contribución académica de Milton Friedman.
From my point of view, Milton Friedman had a fundamental role in recombining the past to the ideas of freedom.
Para recobrar el camino hacia las ideas de la libertad.
In fact, the ideas of freedom until the beginning of the 20th century were the dominant ones.
Entrada la década del 20 del siglo anterior, eran las ideas dominantes.
In fact, the dominant school at that time was the Austrian school.
De hecho, la escuela dominante en ese momento era la escuela austríaca.
But some mistakes, especially the Great Depression, led to the wrong thinking that the ideas of freedom were not the right ones.
Algunos errores, en especial, digamos, lo que implicó la Gran Depresión, llevaron a pensar equivocadamente que las ideas de la libertad no eran las correctas.
And the success of Keynesianism brought the world to a dark corner that would be put to an end in the early 70s.
Al mundo en un cono de oscuridad que se pudo poner fin a inicios de la década del 70.
And that was due to Milton Friedman's contributions. He overthrew the Keynesian apparatus.
Contribuciones de Milton Friedman, cómo derribó el aparato keynesiano.
From my point of view, and this is what I will try to explain in this talk, Milton Friedman's academic work is a mirror work of the general theory of the occupation of the interest and money of Keynes.
Friedman es una obra espejo de la obra, en realidad de la teoría general de la ocupación, el interés y el dinero de Keynes.
Keynes's work is much more extensive, but it refers to the general theory, which is probably one of the worst works of Keynes from the point of view of economic analysis.
O sea, en general, digamos, la referencia suele ser a la teoría general, que probablemente sea uno de los peores trabajos de Keynes desde el punto de vista del análisis económico.
This does not mean that Keynes was a brilliant mind.
Era una mente brillante.
What happens is that he worked for the bad guys. That is, he was part of the bad guys. And so an analytical apparatus was developed in function of the bad guys, so to speak.
De los malos, por decirlo de alguna manera.
So the first point is how the world was prior to the general theory.
¿Cómo era el mundo previo a la teoría general?
In fact, the world in which Keynes himself participated in the debate was the Cambridge School of England, with authors such as Robert Hobbew.
Digamos, con lo que era la escuela de Cambridge, Inglaterra, con, digamos, autores como, por ejemplo, Robertson, digamos,
Who argue within a certain analytical framework and who debated, for example, with the Austrian school, with Mises, with Hayek,
digamos, por ejemplo, con la escuela austríaca, con Mises,
or, let's say, they debated with the Swedish school.
con la escuela sueca.
In that sense, the first thing we should understand was how the previous analytical scheme worked. Let's say it was the whole Wexelian framework.
Entonces, lo primero que deberíamos entender era cómo funcionaba el esquema analítico previo, digamos, que era todo el marco wixeliano.
Basically, the Wexelian framework was an intertemporal economy.
Era una economía de carácter
It was an investment saving scheme wherein the market goods, the interest rate were determined.
de bienes, se determinaba la tasa de interés,
In the money market, the price level was determined.
pero se determinaba el nivel de precio.
That is, it was a model of intertemporal nature because precisely saving is neither more nor less than future consumption.
El ahorro no es ni más ni menos que el consumo futuro.
So why does saving rise when the interest rate rises?
¿Por qué, digamos, sube el ahorro cuando sube la tasa
because basically the interest rate is the relative price of the present goods with respect to the future goods. That is, if the relative price is rising, the interest rate is rising. And the current consumption falls and the future consumption increases. And that is what causes an increased savings. On the other hand, if the future prices were lower than the present prices and the interest rate yesterday, a company should pass production from the present to the future. That is why investment increases. That is why there is a negative relationship between interest rate and investment, and a positive relationship between savings and interest rate, because basically it is an intertemporal model. On the other hand, in the goods market, the purchasing power of money was determined in such a way that when the supply of money increases, the purchasing power of money falls. This is to say, at all the prices expressed in monetary units rise. This analytical framework had methodological defects, but conceptually it is clear. The idea of determining the goods market is the real interest rate or the Wixel interest rate, and to think of the interest rate as an intertemporal mechanism of coordination, and not that aggravation of determining the goods market, which is what Keynes did. But apart from that, they had a problem that they called the invalid dichotomy, and that arose from the fact that the functions of excess demand in a goods market were homogeneous of degree 0 and the homogeneous quantity theory of degree 1. Therefore, this generated problems, a problem that was resolved by Mises, incorporating money in a function of utility and deriving the demand of money under the format of another good more. So when one has an excess, then if you have a central bank artificially lowering the interest rate, that generates an excess of demand in the goods market. The counterpart is an excess of supply in the money market. Therefore, the purchasing power of money falls. Therefore, that is what generates the rise in prices. And if you systematically do this, you generate inflation, or they can generate boom bust cycles. Then they stimulate activity, and then when, as it is generated artificially by the emission of money, in reality it is not genuine, and then when they want to materialize the future consumption, they do not achieve it, and consequently, there is a collapse of the system, which is also part of the contribution of Mises. But beyond this was how the mechanism functioned. What I want to focus on, because Keynes, he came from mathematics. He was a great mathematician, and the analytical structure was understood perfectly. So what Keynes did was destroy this analytical framework, creating a mathematical structure that was functional for messianic, corrupt, and thieving politicians. That is, he wrote a work for those delinquent called politicians. You call them the caste. The caste, exactly. So, notice that the first thing Keynes does is break the intertemporality of the goods market. He breaks the intertemporality of the goods market. And the first thing he does is set up a function of consumption that only depends on income, and generates this monstrosity called marginal propensity to consume. And the multiplier appears, which basically is insane, because the multiplier implies a violation of the budget restriction, because it is the idea of multiplier effect. That is, suppose that you have an economy that consumes 80 and invests 20. It means that a multiplier would tell you that 5 times the investment gives you the GDP. So, what does it say? Well, let's say we raise the investment by emitting money. So if we pass the investment from 20 to 40, then the GDP, instead of being 100, is 200. It's magical. That is, it's just about printing money. The truth is that it is delirious. I know a country that has done that for more than 100 years. It's called Argentina. It must be one of the richest countries in the world. It became a country of half the table. It destroyed 5 monetary systems. It had 2 hyperinflations. But hey, something good had to happen after each such disaster. It was obvious that there were not normal conditions of pressure and temperature. And a liberal libertarian president appeared. Therefore, what that does is that now consumption is not an intertemporal function, and saving becomes a residue. Therefore, it takes away the relationship between the interest rate and saving, and consumption only depends on the income. And at the same time, it destroys the idea of investment depending on the interest rate. Although one of the chapters on investment is brilliant, in the other it says, well, all that does not now depend. I use in Argentina a rather rude expression, that they invest for a lyrical, testicular matter, if they love it. Therefore, let's say now investment ceases to have a functional relationship with the interest rate. It becomes an exogenous thing, the famous animal spirits. Notice that now savings and investment do not determine the interest rate, but now savings and investment determine the income. And from determining the income, they determine the demand for work. Let's say, which in the other system did not make much sense, because all those functions of excess demand from where savings and investment came from, that is, the labor market was included. So what does it imply? From there, the demand for work is derived, which depends on how the added demand is fluctuating. And given the supply, the nominal salary is determined. Then we come to a goods market that now does not determine the real interest rate, but determines the level of income. And on the other hand, the labor market is created where the nominal salary is determined. Now the problem is that now we are missing 2 things to determine. We need to determine the price level and we need to determine the interest rate. So one of the things that Keynes does, he says, okay, then I have to determine the interest rate. And what he does is determine the interest rate in the monetary market, which is an aberration because the interest rate has to do with an intertemporal coordination mechanism of how to pass consumption and production from the present to the future and vice versa. That is, the interest rate exists because there is time. And Keynes puts the interest rate in the monetary market. Then we go from a model where the interest rate was determined in the goods market, and the money acquisition power is to determine the price level in the money market. And now we have that in the goods market, the income is determined. In the money market, the nominal interest rate is determined. And of course, the model lacks how to determine prices. Then it creates the labor market as a linear combination function of what the goods market is, and there determines the nominal salary, and end up destroying the whole theory of value, saying that the prices are a markup over the cost, which in this case would be the salary. That is, it destroys the whole subjective theory of value created by Menger. William Stanley Jevons and Leon Barroso return to the past. It was also placed, it destroys the theory of value. And in this way, it creates a tool. And although it is wonderful for politicians, because then you can spend, and as the demand increases, as you are not in full employment, the system makes you have a first stage where the product grows. a stage where the product grows and the price level grows, and a stage where there is no effect on quantities and everything is at a price. That is basically what Keynes does, and it is a mechanism by which it justifies public intervention. But what is adjacent to that is also a violation of the budget restriction, which is the multiplier. That is why it is tremendous that you go to the Parliament, go to the Chamber of Deputies and talk about the multiplier. That is an intellectual offense because it is something that violates the budget restrictions. Well, these are things that happen between the world of politics and academia. So what we have is that Keynes destroys the entire analytical framework. This is not minor, because there is an article that I love, which is wonderful but has a mistake, which is an article by Axel Eickhoff, which is called the Wixel Connection. And basically what Wixel says is that the Keynes theory on money and the general theory, and there is in the middle is E-theory. And that says that in reality comes from the theory of money. If one adds the preference for liquidity and adds the interest in cash, it reaches the general theory. And it is more in the same article that it says that it would be necessary to make a C-theory, which would be to eradicate the preference for liquidity, because it was a mechanism by which the action of monetary policy was invalidated. And then what it says is that it would be necessary to go to a theory on money, more adjustment of quantities or less preference for liquidity. Those are the Z theories. For me, that is incorrect. And regardless of how wonderful the article is to accommodate the debate, that is incorrect because the analytical framework of the theory on money case is totally different from the case of the general theory. Now, once you have the general theory, then Hicks appears in England. Despite being a disciple of Hicks, that he had many better ones. Like, for example, Mick Schavel. And then Hansen appears in Harvard. And they give rise to what is known as the ESA model, which was a model that determines the income in the stock market and determines in the money market the nominal interest rate. And that Hicks makes an interpretation that although Hicks and Case and the classic makes the proposal of the model of supply and demand added, the supply block was not correctly specified, or in a complete way, so to speak, in some way. So the whole debate was focused on a debate between what is called the Keynesian cross, which is a situation where the investment is absolutely insensitive to the interest rate and there are preferences for liquidity. Therefore, they have a flat LM and a vertical is, or the classic world, which is the other cross, which is the demand for money, let's say, is a fraction of the income, and therefore there is no role for monetary policy. The LM is vertical, while the investment is absolutely insensitive to the interest rate, and therefore this is flat. And that is basically the discussion between the Keynesian model and the discussion between the classic model, and where the Keynesian model is extreme. The tax policy is powerful, and the monetary policy is absolutely useless. And in the case of a classic case, the tax policy is tremendously harmful because it causes a crowding out effect, because the expansion of public spending generates a rise in the interest rate that it has as a counterpart, a drop in private investment. Therefore, it is agreed that the productivity of private investment is usually substantially higher. Let's say that it would be better to leave things in private hands, while in terms of monetary policy it is perfectly effective. But the problem is that this later manifests itself as an increase in prices. So there was a whole discussion about the elasticity. And there is all the discussion of the bigger effect. So that what Pigou does is try to refute the Keynesian argument that only depended on the consumption of the income, and that also depended on the real balance, and that then you could boost the demand by injecting money. And that was the debate. It was absolutely crazy. Until a man called Milton Friedman came along and began to break what Keynes did in the general theory. In other words, you want to repair the damage done by Keynes. So this is the first great contribution of Milton Friedman, which in fact is one of those for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize winner in economics. It is a book called A Theory on the Function of Consumption, where he develops the hypothesis of permanent income, where when the income rises permanently, consumption automatically accompanies the increase in income. Therefore, the marginal profit of consumption tends to be 1. And when you have a transitory increase, as that is going to spread throughout an intertemporal sequence, then the savings increases and you do not have an instantaneous or full translation on the income level. Therefore, the first thing he does there is return the intertemporality to the function of consumption. And by returning the intertemporality to the function of consumption, the interest rate returns to have an important role in the determination of consumption, and therefore in the work. So now what he had to break? Well, now what he had to prove was that the investment was sensitive to the interest rate. And on the other hand, he had to counteract this idea that monetary policy was not effective, that he had left the idea of the trap of liquidity, and on what the Keynesians worked to prove that monetary policy was not effective. For example, you can take the horse to water, but you cannot force him to drink. They cannot force him to drink water. Then if there is a limit for the interest rate, it is 0, and therefore they cannot go further, and then they cannot force the horse to drink water. Then sometime later we saw, when it was the crisis of 2008, you came to see a case of negative interest rates, but that is part of another discussion. Then Milton Friedman, together with Anna Jacobson Schwartz, writes a book called Monetary History of the United States. And in chapter 7, which is the Great Contraction from 1929 to 1933, he basically shows 2 things. First, that monetary policy was not effective. It was tremendously effective, because precisely the Great Depression occurs because of a bad management of the central bank, that is, of the Federal Reserve. And there he shows that precisely in the face of a banking panic, where what happens is that people get scared. He left the banks which had a system of fractionary exchange, and they were going to demand cash. That also generated a fall in the demand for goods. And therefore, let's say, it generated a situation of deflation. Let's say, then applying the Fisher effect, automatically the debts in terms of income were increasing, and the companies were going bankrupt. And at the same time, as the banks borrow short money and lend long, and they run out of deposits, they have liquidity problems, and then they stop giving loans. And then it explains how that action of the Federal Reserve, in the face of a race in a system of fractionary exchange, is what truly generated the disaster. That when monetary policy was corrected, the United States came out of the Great Depression. Therefore, what this case shows is that the hypothesis of the liquidity trap was only a methodological trap, a mathematical trap to precisely generate this idea that monetary policy is not effective and justify fiscal policy. At the same time, the hypothesis of permanent income takes strength away from it. In addition, this is later perfected by Borrow. In the 1974 paper, let's say, he make expansionary fiscal policy. They can't agents the future taxes. Therefore, let's say, fiscal policy ceases to have effect. But not only that, but it also shows that investments are not undertaken in function of the nominal interest rate. They are a function of the real interest rate. And when you take the real interest rate increased substantially. Therefore, the investment collapsed. So there, basically, what Friedman does is return the intertemporality to the consumption function and, therefore, to the savings function. He returns the value of the intertemporality, that is, the weight of the interest rate, explaining the investment. And in addition, it also shows that monetary policy is effective. But it was not enough with that. But that it was not enough because there was still hard to deal with the problem of the liquidity trap, the relationship between the amount of money and the level of prices. Then Milton Friedman does the work, and the quantitative theory shows that the demand for money is a stable function, and being a stable function, when you increase the amount of money, you have an increase in prices. And hence Friedman coins that famous phrase that says inflation is always everywhere, a monetary phenomenon, and I usually complement with a phrase that says generated with an excess of money supply. When the supply goes up, because it fell to the ground, two things happened at the same time, and that translates into a loss of the purchasing power of money, which implies that all the prices of the monetary unit go up. Therefore, in these works, as I'm mentioning, whether it is the function of consumption, monetary history, the works of quantitative theory, recomposes saves investment, determining the interest rate, the effectiveness of monetary policy, and that in the money market is determined by the level of prices. Now, what happens? Milton Friedman did not live in Mars. He lived on planet Earth, with some beasts that argued in the term of SLM. So he does a wonderful work by Milton Friedman called The Monetary Framework of Milton Friedman. And in that context, what does he do? Friedman puts all these elements in the construction of what we, let's say in literature, let's say if you want Modigliani, if you want, let's say, Carnegie, let's say they call him the classic model, and that places him against the Keynesian model. So he tells the Keynesians, look, because the whole first part is synthesized in one sentence, the Keynesians do not have a way to determine the level of prices in the SLM, let's say. Therefore, the Keynesians, strong models, let's say, are much more precarious than, let's say, Keynes. In fact, I believe that Hicks himself was shocked to see all that. In fact, when he was given the Nobel Prize in 1971 to Hicks, together with Iran, one of the things that Hicks says, they are giving him the Nobel for a contribution that I don't feel so proud of, but a classic Keynesian article where the SLM is developed. SLM, in addition, is the terminology of Hansen, because he called it ISO. In other words, as you will see, I have a picky question with the articles and others, but, as you will see, it sounds quite strange, because I am talking about economic theory. No, it's not strange, I heard. Yes, it's not strange, it's very strange. So, there, what the word says. Accelerating the inflation rate. Then Keynes says, you cannot explain this, because you have no way to determine the price level. In other words, the logic of that first part of the book is that you cannot explain this, because you have no way to determine the price level, because you are determining the nominal interest rate in the money market, and you are determining the income in the goods market, and therefore you cannot determine anything. So then, a man called Phillips appears and finds a relationship between the rate of percentage variation of nominal wages with respect to the unemployment level. He finds a negative relationship. From that, Richard Lipset, based on his hypothesis that he had been working in the labor market, and based on the fact that Keynes himself had said that the prices were determined as a markup on the costs. That is to say, let's active read it to Keynes. So that makes the prices a linear combination of wages, and consequently, you can find a relationship between the rate of variation of prices and the rate of unemployment. And that contribution is accompanied by an empirical estimation by Samuel Solisolo, where they test the Phillips curve, and from there, recommendations are made. Well, then, if I want to have a lower rate of unemployment, I have to endure this level of inflation, and the world was going around with those things. Obviously, Mr. Milton Friedman said that he was quite angry, so to speak, for a few years, a topic that he resolves in the year 1968, in parallel to Edmund Phelps. In other words, he sent me a book dedicated to Edmund Phelps, like, let's say, dedicated to President Phillips for eradicating Argentine inflation. And in that context, Friedman, where he writes the most read economic article in history, which is the role of monetary policy, and that's where he develops the Phillips curve, increased by inflation. And it's interesting because later, if you read the second edition of the book, Theory of Prices, he dedicates a part to the Phillips curve. He dedicates a chapter to the Phillips curve, and this is very important. This, I would say, beyond closing the debate about the Phillips curve, the most important thing is that it returns to the micro foundations. How does he do to bring down the Phillips-Milton-Friedman curve? This is the important thing. He goes back to the classic foundations. That is, he goes and gets into the labor market. So he says, in the labor market, you have an offer and demand of work that depends on the real wage. But what happens? The expectations in the Friedman model are adaptive. It has to do with what happened with the previous prices. So what happens is today the monetary policy changes in the central bank. Let's say the expectations are formed with all prices. So what happens? The monetary policy changes in the central bank. It injects money. So people start to spend more. So the businessmen, what are they seeing? That their business prospects are improving. Therefore, they see the real wages falling, and therefore, they go out to hire more money. And on the other hand, the workers who are looking with the past expectations, with their own monetary policy, believe that their real wages are rising. So transitorily, all transactions are out of balance, and transitorily, the level of economic activity increases. Therefore, when you screw up the monetary policy, then the inflation rate drops. Why? Because the expectations are adaptive. Now, when the agents see that they miss the expectations, they go back, and then the unemployment rate stays at the natural level, and you go to a higher level of inflation, where, let's say, the contribution of firms in the hypothesis of serial accident says that If you want to keep the unemployment rate down systematically below the natural level, you have to be accelerating the inflation rate all the time. I mean, almost everyone ends up with a lot of inflation, and in that context, let's say the debate ends because it ends up defeating the Greeks in the last refuge they had left, and the one who, let's say, ends up ending all this is in the year 1972, Robert Lucas Jr., in the paper of the Journal of Economic Theory, where, using the hypothesis of math, of rational expectations applied to macroeconomics, ends up showing that the Phillips curve is vertical. But while Friedman's plan had a short trade-off and no long trade-off, in the case of Robert Lucas, if the individuals knew the monetary policy, automatically they corrected for it, and then there was no trade-off, not even in the short term, and the only thing the politician could do was, even, let's say, monetary policy, make a regime change, deceive the agents, transitorily get an effect, but that would then be diluted. And what he says that, even that this volatility has an impact on the ability to respond to the supply. The more volatility you give them, the less the supply responds. And this, Robert Lucas Jr. ends up closing it in the year 1973, when he does the empirical validation of the Phillips curve with rational low expectations, which also generates a debate about rules and discretion, where clearly is better the policy of rules, and in fact, he had also made a Friedman contribution, putting himself on the side of rules. So, from my point of view, Friedman's work in the academic plane, we have the recovery of the intertemporal, of consumption, of savings, the recovery of the function of investment, the power of monetary policy, the monetary nature of inflation, the value of rules, and the return to micro fundaments. And this, the return to micro fundaments, and the intertemporal, makes Robert Lucas Jr. say, let's see, what are we arguing about? Because the truth is that we spent almost 30 years arguing nonsense. Actually, almost 40 years arguing nonsense. You want 37 years. So, what are we doing? So, there, with the return to micro fundaments and the intertemporal, Robert Lucas Jr. asks, well, let's see. Let's stop the ball. And what do we want to talk about when we talk about economy? So, what did he do? He returned to the sources. That is, he returned to Adam Smith. And, although there are 3 books by Adam Smith, one that has articles that were less there, turning around, which, let's say, was compiled after Adam Smith's death. It has the theory of moral sentiments, and it has the investigation about Nietzsche and the cause of the richness of nations that are known as civilizations for his friends. So, in that context, he says, what did he want to explain to Adam Smith? Economic grace. And then he begins to explore economic grace. So, let's say, what happens is that they come across the Solow model and the empirical problems that the Solow model had, that all mean explained 15% of growth, and all the rest was waste. Obviously, Robert Lucas Jr. would not go to spend too much on the Hearts and Doe models, obviously. So, in that context, he begins to explore other cases that say, like what he had done, that say, with the topic of learning by doing. But there were problems because the models did not converge. They had certain problems. And all that discussion then went and revalued the Ramsey model again, but the Ramsey model fixed, let's say, the problem of dynamic efficiency, but it could not generate long-term growth once it reached the stationary state. So it was a growth model that does not imply growth, and that all the growth came from outside. So it was a whole problem. And then in the 80s, a gentleman, a mathematician, decides to go to study at the University of Chicago, and his thesis tutor is Robert Lucas Jr., Mr. Paul Robert, their Nobel Prize in Economics. He is the one who develops the endogenous growth models, and from there, Lucas popularizes the idea of endogenous growth in the readings of Ronald Robbins in 1985. And from there, the whole new macroeconomics appears in an intertemporal format with all the endogenous growth models, and that, let's say, culminates in the theory of real cycles, a deeply interesting theory. You will say, and what do you have to say about the theory of real cycles? And look, I'm going to give you some applications. The first is that when I arrived, we were at the brink of hyperinflation, and the only way we had to cut, let's say, the inflation was by cutting the growth of the amount of money, and for that we had to make a fiscal adjustment and an assessment of the balance of the central bank. We had a deficit consolidated with 15 points of the GDP, 5 in the reserve, and 10 in the central bank, and we decided to undertake the largest fiscal adjustment in the history of humanity with an adjustment of 15 points of the GDP. That was concluded in a 6-month period, and the consumer inflation that came to 54% monthly, which is 17,000% annually. The last available date was 1.2%. That is to say, from 17,000% to 15% annually. So, as you will see, I believe in the monetary nature of inflation, but on the other hand, and more in my Austrian spirit, because from 2014, I became an almost fanatic devotee, fundamentalist of the Austrian school, to the point that not only I fell in love with Mises and Hayek, but I fell in love with Rothbard, and I became an anarchist. Moreover, I am an anarcho-capitalist. So, in addition, I despise the state, and I am inside the state, to break everything, to crush it. In fact, I have a ministry, that is the Ministry of Regulation. We made a structural reform that is 8 times larger than the one in Kissimmee, which had been the biggest in history. That is, we made 800 structural reforms every day. My Minister of Regulation, a brilliant economist, and an excellent human being, such as Federico Sturzenegger, every day he deregulates something. I am going to tell you a very funny anecdote. There was a meeting, in a military meeting of the G20, with Modi in India. So I told him, I only have here my Minister of Happiness, because, let's say, my Minister of Economy cuts things. I mean, he is the one from La Mato Sira. I joined my Minister of Economy. In addition, he was elected the best Minister of Economy in the world. I crack. Everything touches point. And on the other hand, I have Sturzenegger, which also gives me a lot of happiness when he regulates. So, in general, one reviews between 1 and 5 regulations per day, and that day I say 4. And today, for example, I tell you, it was a day that gave me a lot of joy because he eliminated 4 regulations. I think that because of Federico's education, he didn't tell me anything, because I think that if he had marked me the error, it would have been tremendous, because he had not taken out 4 regulations. He had taken out 44. I mean, I think that either I jumped and gave him a hug, let's say a fanatic, or alternatively, he would have caused me the dance up on the table. He took out 44 regulations that had an impact on the price. A wonderful thing. So he could have resisted it. Today, the meeting would have been dynamic. It seems that I was exaggerating, but those who know me really know that in front of a guy of that characteristic, I can get very euphoric. So the meeting would have ended quickly, and I would have gone to celebrate with Nice to Senegal. So much productivity. Therefore, this is also unique in the history of modern democracies. We, next year, have electoral year, and we enter the year that comes with the commitment of deficit zero. That if there's growth, and it is permanent, we lower taxes, and in addition, emission zero. That is to say, without fiscal policy, and without active monetary policy. Tell me if that is not believing the real business of the film. And to finish, on the 10th, the day I made the speech, I had the luck to speak by a very prestigious Argentine economist who is called Juan Pablo Nicolini, who works in the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis, and he told me about a work that he did that determines how much the Argentine economy can grow from the balance that he is supposed to have. In other words, we have the balance of the financial line. That is, we pay the operating expenses and we pay the interests. And in that sense, the work only looks at the impact on the growth rate of the GDP per capita of the tax balance, and only with the tax balance, Argentina is assured, according to the work by Robert Lucas Jr., a growth of 4.5% per year. In other words, in about 10 years, Argentina is going to make its GDP grow by at least 50%. And as we were talking with Dr. Nicolini, but that is a vice. That is a vice, because we achieve the tax balance by shrinking the state. As we have economic growth, we are going to lower the taxes. We are going to remove the state from the middle. We are going to give more freedom to people, and that will also generate more growth. In fact, the structural reform that we did allowed us to jump about 70 positions in terms of economic freedom, between being among the worst and most unrepresentable in the world. Today we are in the middle, and I still have 3,200 structural reforms in my pocket. Therefore, I am going to make Argentina the freest country in the world. As Ireland did for 30 years, it became the richest country in the world. Let's say the richest, but today they have 50% more GDP per capita than that of the United States. But not only that, but also, if you contemplate all the structural reforms that we are putting, surely Argentina will grow much more than 4.5%, and that will make us still attached to the city of freedom. And defending the city of freedom, we will make Argentina great again. We're going to make Argentina a power again, and we are going to be an example for everyone of what works is the city of freedom. Long live Argentina. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.